In this video, I'm going to be talking about the egoic self, which is a concept that I'm going to be introducing. And what the egoic self involves, it involves this healthy sense of ego integration and a real dial back of the selfish aspects of the self. And the self can characterize a lot of aspects that are actually original to the ego and involve the ego directly, which characterizes our self-subjectivity and this self-understanding, and is where self-knowledge really begins. It's associated with the meaning that we perceive directly through our perceptions and which is vital for our well-being. And the meaning that occurs regarding our perceptions is very much bound in directing us towards what facilitates greater optimal well-being. So when we perceive something, often it's telling us to regulate negative emotion as well as promote more of these positive states of emotion that come through meaning, through establishing things like knowledge, as well as impressions of the environment, and sometimes what feels good, or more positive perceptions, positive motivations, positive emotions, positive feelings, positive actions, positive behaviors, and more positive meaning, what's meaningful to us as individuals. Also, as what we value directly, and contains more of these strengths that come through our habits and our routines and particularly our patterns of behavior, the patterns that we might find throughout various perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, actions, behaviors, and processes of expression regarding the self, and various components of the self that involves the mind, aspects of human agency such as the will, a willingness, a direction to where we are orienting ourself towards and directing our energy. In particular, it's more of this pivoting function that it performs regarding the self and its characteristic of the self. And the ego is the origin of what supports an individual at its fundament. It regards the sense that I am in relation to the surroundings and surrounding objects, though it doesn't necessarily go so far as to recognize the self unless we're talking about us within a species. Across, say, animals and maybe potentially plants, though the scientific research isn't quite there yet, but within animals that even through our direct experiences, through direct philosophy, regardless of where the science has come in terms of understanding and appreciating the very complex levels of perceptual processing and variance across various species in terms of their psychological capacities that they can understand, their perceptions and what they can appreciate, and also what they're satisfied with, and various aspects of this subjective well-being is more difficult to tap into, but to some extent can be triangulated through inferences that we can make through our understandings of psychology that can give us insight into some subtle aspects of subjective experience, where for us as human beings, we have much direct access to our direct perceptions through things like self-reports and communication, as well as our behaviors, our direct observable behaviors that involve these self-expressions that are unique to us as human beings, and that involve selfhood, which comes from ego, a higher level of self-knowledge that can characterize understandings of other selves in relation to ego. So the egoic self involves an integration of ego that is unselfish, because when the ego is in balance, that's when we start to have the pathologies of the self, which are also aspects of the self. And so that you see this often this tension within Western and Eastern philosophy in regards to whether, is there a self or not? And it's a very big, large, overarching, perennial philosophical and scientific problem, and one that's directly related to the problem of well-being and knowledge, particularly a knowledge that is associated with this dual philosophical question that I think is probably one of the most important and centerpieces to philosophy, is one regarding well-being and the nature of thoughtfulness in terms of promoting well-being. and the question of thoughtfulness itself, and what is thoughtfulness, how it impacts us as individuals, and how this is directly aligned with leading more meaningful, fulfilling lives. And I believe that thoughtfulness is a direct pathway to the good life through this meaningful life that it cultivates in terms of putting meaning to use within our perceptions. So you can think of meaning as these components that might not have any value, significance, or a sense of meaningfulness that invigorates it. And meaning is intrinsic to things like human motivation and perception, as well as actions, feelings, emotions, behaviors. It's direct to our precepts, and it's pretty much involved in everything we do. It characterizes all the processes and expressions in regards to the self. And when we start to recognize our ego, we recognize a particular precept that is vital to well-being, not just in optimizing it, but literally sustaining it and keeping it going, supporting it, protecting it, preserving it, as well as proliferating it through more of these authentic forms of expression that, when they manifest in an optimizing direction, what occurs is not just an expression of the self, it's a regulation of selfish behaviors, an expression of the character self. And the character self is a component that extends from the egoic self, which is this higher self-integration between all aspects of the self. And you can think of the egoic as very much the overarching origin and what the self requires in order to be sustained, while the self serves more of an intermediate role between the expressions of character and the ego. And the self is the primary mode of which we encounter the world. And so you can think of the self as in some sense a form of psychology, and the ego as characterizing this conscious, almost that we can often conflate with the self, this conscious direct process, more parallel to our perceptions or conscious perceptions, that are to some degree indistinguishable from the mind and the self as well, and also the will. While the character self has more to do with our perceptions of virtue, as well as our actual strengths and our actual well-being, our optimal well-being, and our capacity to optimize well-being, and the effectiveness of our individual capacity to optimize well-being, and our actual effect on achieving that goal related to the self. Because in this discussion, we're talking about the nature of the self rather than the nature of things in the environment and the actual effects that they have, which would regard more of a scientific or a philosophy of science discussion, where this is pertaining to the philosophy of science, but more to the philosophy of science of self and the nature of the self, and the psychology of the self, and the philosophy of the psychology of the self. So the egoic self very much is the ideal here, and the self is more about learning how to regulate aspects of the self and its other components, such as the id, which have more to do with these primal urges, and the superego, which helps us to develop these character orientations, but which is often can form these pathologies in regards to the self that can produce these imbalances that manifest as selfish behavior. So the id and even the ego, as well as the superego, can all be sources of selfishness, but at the same time, they can be sources of optimizing behavior, and that's primarily done through the self. And the egoic self is a healthy integration of all those, when all of those are in balance, and it can also extend into these character expressions and involve the character self, which is when we start to utilize our strengths and to align the ideal with the actual in terms of direct perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, actions, behaviors, the meaning that we develop, as well as the knowledge that we can establish within our own perceptions, and the value that we cultivate, as well as purposeful perception, motivation, action, emotion, feeling, and behavior, as well as various processes and expression related to the meaning laden and the value laden behind purposeful pursuits. and purposeful direction. So it's very important to understand the differences between the egoic self, the self, and the character self, where the character self applies more to the situated context. The egoic self has more to do with this higher self, or the idea of moving towards the good life and embodying the best versions of ourselves in the present moment. It involves this direct present mind, and it's often the self that we are most of the time. While the self can, at times, it's more fluent, and it's much more related to a holistic aspect of the self that is more useful for, in some sense, monitoring our well-being. And it often should require a training and self-training, self-regulation, in order to move to or recognize the character self, but also recognize, firstly, the egoic self. And in doing so, we can return back to that egoic self and integrate the id with the ego and the superego in relation to the self, rather than acting on what might come up and percolate up from unconscious processes or subconscious processes, or even conscious processes that we might not want to attend to or like, and that have a negative meaning, and something that we don't find meaningful, but we can find negative meanings in, or even meaningless, which is contradictory, and can produce these unpleasant sensations and feelings that are involved directly in this cognitive dissonance that's associated with the discussions of nihilism I've been talking about, in terms of rejecting meaning and knowledge, particularly meaning, to the universe and to life in general, while at the same time basing all the arguments and propositions and every utterance on systems of meaning, which are self-contradictory, and which don't actually represent the information and reality or knowledge and what's true. What's true is that arguably everything is meaningful, and it is completely meaningful in the highest degree, but it's perception in which we select for what is more meaningful compared to other things. And this continuum of meaningfulness is what creates this characterization of things as potentially being meaningless to us as individuals, rather than meaningless at all. Because it's not like it lacks any use or capacity to be rendered into knowledge or to access information, or that it doesn't even have an influence on our perceptions at a conscious, unconscious, or subconscious level. Rather, what's occurring is that our perceptions have meaning bound to it, and that's a direct aspect intrinsic to life. It's internal to the process of living and promoting greater well-being and optimizing well-being. And in a similar vein, ego is intrinsic to all individuals and organisms, particularly animal life, and the self is intrinsic to us as human beings and civilizations, and emerges from these developments and higher recognition of ego. And so the egoic self is a unique aspect of civilization and a characteristic of these integration between our animalistic as well as our humanistic identities and qualities and characteristics that can have higher forms of expression in these situated contexts that manifest within this elasticity that comes from a character expression and our character strengths that align ideal with the actual in the appropriate context. And it's important to not conflate the character self from the egoic self, because the character self can be wrong, and it has much more to do with calibrating the ideal with the actual. And so one can very much act within the character self and perform an act that is uncharacteristic of the characteristic self that they're trying to enact or embody. And in doing so, what's occurring here is somebody might want to act virtuously or do something good or utilize their strengths for the benefit of optimizing a particular situation in regards to the self and in relation to the surroundings. but the actual effect is negative, or it goes contradictory to their direct perceptions and what they believe will occur if they perform X behavior. And so there's a mismatch between the ideal and the actual. And what's important to do here is to recognize the egoic self, to be able to correct for that situation and develop greater self-knowledge and self-intelligence that will allow us to regulate the self, and particularly the situated self that comes in between those things. And this should reduce the selfish behaviors, but increase the egoic behaviors and our egoic needs, wants, and meaning that are all aspects of what directs us in the world and energizes us, and where we guide our efforts towards accomplishing meaningful goals and pursuits and developing greater meaning in life. So that's just a little bit about the egoic self. I hope you enjoy, and that's all for this video.